Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the TipHaus Insider webinar, where today we are actually going to be tackling one of my favorite and most studied and most adored topics here of tip pooling versus tip sharing. How to understand which one of these is right for your restaurant and making sure that you're using what makes the most sense for your operations. Now, as always, I'm going to cover us off with just a little bit of an agenda here. So some webinar housekeeping notes to be mindful of, a little bit of the goals for the attendees and what we're hoping you take out of this. Understanding that tip pooling and tip sharing, of course, deciding which one of those is right and how to use them in conjunction with one another. And then, of course, how to implement those using TipHaus should you be an existing customer, prospect, or you're looking to learn more. And as always, we do have a Q&A section. So worth noting here is that there is always going to be a live Q&A going on in a live chat. If there are questions as we are going or as you see me going through these items, do not hesitate to ask them in the chat. And at the end, I will make time to come back through and answer as many of those as I can. This is recorded. And so if you're experiencing technical difficulties, as we all do in the new era, if you have to jump off for a call or anything of that sort, whatever reason, do not be fret. Do not worry about it at all. We will share this recording with everyone who is registered for the webinar at the end via email. And last but not least, as a reward for people, always trying to advance the industry, trying to learn more, trying to make sure that we're always on top and providing the best services to our guests, our customers, our employees themselves, we do offer a $100 gift card winner, randomly selected here. So at the end, we will be announcing that winner. And without further ado, I will introduce myself. And hello, everyone. If you've never been here before, I am Kurt Grogan, co-founder and COO of TipHaus, and I will be running you through everything here with us today. So kicking into this and starting to look from the top, understanding tip pooling, tip sharing. What are they? Why do they matter? Who uses them? How do we use them effectively to make sure that we're maximizing the benefits for a business? We're keeping legal compliance tight and making sure we're not violating any local or state level laws. And of course, making sure that our employees understand what's going on and we're doing what's best for them to keep them happy and maintain that employee retention. So to start with, we'll just take it out and let's look at what tip pooling really is. So tip pooling is employees combining their tips into a common fund or pool that they withdraw that money from that same fund or pool. What's really important to note over here is that this is a bi-directional movement of money. So the same employees that are putting their money into the fund will also be withdrawing that money. Now, it may not be in the exact same allocations. There's going to be some logic applied to it to understand how much you should put in versus how much you should withdraw. But important to note in the distinguishing factor of a tip pool is that the individuals who are putting money in are also taking money out. Whereas when you look at something like tip sharing, this is employees contributing a specific percentage of their earnings to another group of employees. This is a single or one directional movement of money. And so what we see here is that this is typically best done to reward supporting staff or groups that may not have direct opportunities for revenue, or individuals that are directly responsible for the guest satisfaction that may not actually be the ones dropping the check or swiping that card. So what we always want to look at and understand is how do we use these two in conjunction and what do we want to make sure of? So when we're thinking about these, we have to make sure we're abiding by county laws, state laws, federal laws, always with it. We have to make sure that we're getting the money to our supporting staff in the equivalent amount of effort that they're putting in. And of course, we have to make sure that our sales staff, these servers and bartenders, these individuals on the floor actually making this happen, are keeping enough tips to make them satisfied. Ultimately, your goal is always to make sure that we have a very cohesive team that understands how and why they're working together. So let's just look at a very quick and easy tip sharing example. So remember, tip sharing is money moving in one direction from one group of employees to another group or groups of employees. And so in this example, we'll say that there are two tip sharing rules that exist. And what these two rules are is that servers and bartenders are going to be sharing 3% of the tips with their host. Servers share 5% of their tips with the bartender. Okay, so in this instance, we have two servers, both of whom have earned $50 throughout the night. And when we look at that rule, we're saying, okay, 3% of tips go to the host. So 3% of that 50 is $1.50, and that's going straight to the host. Whereas bartenders are paid 5% of the tips for them making the drinks and making sure everything gets out on time to those guests at the tables. So 5% of that 50 is going to be $2.50. So when we look at that and we play through what that math actually starts to do here, we will see that server A and server B are giving that money to the bartender. So the bartender should be coming $5 up on their tip rules, right? They have made $5, $2.50 each from each one of the servers for their work for them. Whereas that bartender also has to pay out to the host. And so when we see this all together here, the host will start with $0. They never have the chance to actually be directly tipped because they do not have a POS on site. They're not running any of these credit cards. They're not dropping that credit card slip receipt. So the host has earned $0, but will take in $3 from the servers and $1.20 from the bar. Whereas the servers have each lost $4. When you look at it, they should have lost 8% of $50. Makes sense there. And then, of course, the bartender is generating $5 from the work for the servers, but also giving up $1.20 to the work the host is doing for he or she. So with that in mind, this is a very, very simple tip sharing policy. All the math checks out. This is one way we can start to create a more cohesive team here. Now, let's look at something a little more complex. And this is going to be a combination of a tip pool and a tip share. And this is a very common scenario we see with many of our customers in the real world. So in this restaurant, we have 4 servers that are working. We have 2 bartenders that are working. And we have a support staff of a host and a busser. And now in this rule, what we're going to be seeing is that 3 rules exist, or 3 pieces of tip logic are overlaid on this restaurant and the service staff within it. Servers and bartenders are sharing 5% of their tips with the support staff. These are the individuals who are delighting the guests, seating them, getting those tables cleaned, making sure that everything is going smoothly so that your servers and bartenders can focus strictly on that guest satisfaction. Also, we have servers sharing 5% of their tips with the bartender. Same philosophy here is that these bartenders are spending time that they could be serving their own guests to pour beers or pour wine or make nice cocktails for the guests that the servers are serving and will ultimately be tipped by, right? So something should be received back to the bartenders for the work they're doing to ensure that their fellow employees are generating the highest amount of tips they can have and your guests are as satisfied as possible. And lastly, bartenders are pooling tips amongst themselves. In this scenario with 2 bartenders, we will also often see, one bartender is going to be serving all the guests seated at the bar, and one bartender may be working the well, getting those drinks out to the floor. We don't want them to worry about who is working which. We want them to know that both of them are critical to the entire restaurant operating as a team and all guests having a great experience. So we're actually just going to have those bartenders pool tips amongst themselves. Now, if we were to apply all of that logic and we overlaid it with some math here, and I'll show you what we're looking at here on the left, is how much did people bring in before tip distribution logic was applied? And on your right, you're going to start to see that after tip distribution logic applied, what occurred? When we look at those rules, and I'll slide back here so we can review those one more time. When we look at all 3 of these rules that are existing, what is going to actually happen in a real world scenario? So first that I want to draw close attention to is the bottom of that screen, total tips 400 on both sides. It is unbelievably important that we always remember the total amount of tips that are brought in must also be paid out to that staff. The managers can never keep any tips. Not once under federal law are managers allowed to take tips out of this. The house themselves, the restaurant, can never have tips. So we always want to make sure that every single penny that is brought in from service staff is accounted for getting paid out to service and supporting staff that are making this happen. Now, in that rules that we saw earlier, again, bartender A is the individual serving the guest at the bar. And so they're actually getting direct tips. They're dropping checks. They're making sure they get signed receipts back. Whereas bartender B, the individual working the well, making sure that everything is getting out to these guests at the tables, they have $0 in tips. So these 2 are going to end up being pooling tips. And as you see over here, they should be equal in the end. But a couple things have to happen before then. So our servers, we have 4 of them working. 2 of them brought in $50 in tips each. 2 brought in $100 each. And then finally, we have our host and our busser, critical members of the entire restaurant, but not directly receiving tips. So when we start to look at this, we have bartenders and servers who should both be giving up tips to the host and busser. And we see here, of course they are. There's going to be 5% get kicked over from both sides, and they're going to now walk away with $10 in tips each. Whereas the bartenders are going to be pooling tips and receiving part of this tip out from the servers. So when we look at this and we see that 10% of tips should have been total given up from all servers, where we started with $50 over here, we are now down to 45. So that is working correctly. And similarly, where we started with $100 over here, We are now working with 90 on server C and D, and that is also working correctly. So we're looking good on that front. And if we run the math through all of this, we are now left with $400 in tips total, or the exact outcome that we were hoping to expect, right? The same amount of tips have come in, have gone out, and what we're doing is redistributing these tips to the individuals that are most delighting our guests, that are making sure they have a great experience, and that are making sure your restaurant runs smoothly, right? These tables get turned over. These tables are clean. The guests have been greeted the moment they walked in the door, informed their table is ready, taken to it, told about the specials, whatever it may be that your staff is looking for. We always want to make sure that we have tip logic in place that applies accordingly. So if we were to look at this and choosing the best tip management, for your business, what strategies should I evoke here? You really need to take a deep dive into your business, right? So how many employees do you have? What are the supporting roles? What are the opening and closing duties and on-shift duties for these individuals? Are they rolling silverwares afterwards? Do they really get to clock in, take their tables, clock out, and go home? And a whole support staff feeds into that program. You need to understand your employee preferences. Different regions, different demographics, different geographic areas all have totally different concepts of what's common and not. Many of you, if you're a restaurant operation in the Northeast versus, somewhere out in California, you'll have seen that your employees are often going to be understanding that there's a baseline, there's expectation and understanding of what's expected. Similarly, if you have your servers that are bussing their own tables, they're expoing, they're running their own food, typically they're going to be giving up less tips, right? They don't have quite that supporting staff around them. So we always want to take into all these considerations. And of course, last and certainly not least is this customer experience. What is the experience you want the customer to have? Do you want high touch points where they're getting touched on by the servers? A bartender comes over to check in on the cocktail, that you've got an expo running QA in the back end, and you have food runners dropping the food and a busser coming by to clear plates? Or is this really a customized one-on-one experience with that server who's responsible for all of that work and therefore probably not taking as many tables, right? All of these things have to be considered when you're really thinking about what you want your business to run. A case study that I think is going to be dropped in the chat here in just a moment that I'd encourage everyone to read if you're looking at a great way to implement or improve your tip distribution methods. Ivar's is a fabulous Pacific Northwest staple. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen their clam chowder in grocery stores sold nationwide. But in addition to saving a ton of time, money, legal errors, and frustrations on their side, they also were able to improve their employee retention rates by 31% by enabling tips through TipHaus. This is so critical, and we know the turnover rates in this industry that are astronomically high. So if we can keep that staff around longer, if we can keep them happier, we have better guest experiences, we have more knowledge that is already internally trained in the company, lots and lots of good outcomes if we can just make sure that we get the inputs there right of tips. And then, of course, there are plenty of success stories from businesses using tip pooling and tip sharing. But for now, what I would love to show you is a live demo of what TipHaus looks, how we want to think about these tip policies, how we can simplify a lot of restaurants' operations. But most importantly, just get your head spinning around the idea of, okay, where are tips designed to go? What should we be thinking? How do we get the outcomes that we are hoping for? So with that, I will share a different screen here for you, and bear with me as I load this up. Alrighty. Now, what we should be seeing here, if everything has gone smoothly, is the home screen of the TipHaus dashboard. And what you're looking at here is all of the tip datas and metrics that you've wished you had your whole life. While your POS can tell you how much tips you brought in from an employee level, it can't tell you the tips that are distributed and paid out on that employee level because it's not picking up the logic or the distributions that are occurring, right? All we're seeing is that servers and bartenders bring tips in, and something happens in the background, generally an Excel sheet, sometimes handwritten on paper, and then we're writing that out and paying out these employees. When you adjust your tip logic and when we actually impact our tip logic in TipHaus, you can always come back to the screen and see the impact and say, hey, what I was really hoping for is that tip percentages go up in the store because I've implemented supporting staff around them so that they can give more service, better service to these guests. Or maybe you want to understand a little bit about, how much does the average bartender make across my 3 locations? And does one location really stand out, right? We can start to see what the take home per hour by job code is. You can adjust this tip logic in real time and then come back and look at the impacts of how it impacted your staff and what that looked like. But to understand TipHaus, I always like to begin here on the reporting screen. And so TipHaus brings in 2 sets of data here. And what we're always going to be paying attention to are the sales data that is going through and the worked shifts. Who was working? When were they working? What job code were they working? Did they take breaks, paid, unpaid, etc.? So we will pull all information in. There is no onboarding in the sense that you have to populate this data. All of this is automatically brought into TipHaus from your point of sale and your time and attendance platform. What we can even get down to as granular is seeing each individual check and the distributions that occurred here. So when we have a rule or tip logic in place, we can see that Chelsea, as a server, was sharing her tips back to the bartenders who helped make the drink. And there were 3 bartenders working that day. And here's the distribution of how much money they made during it. So we can get as granular as the thousandth of a penny, and we always will, to make sure that you are compliant and you understand what is going on your side of the equation. Now, the real crux of the situation and the real magic of TipHaus occurs here in what's called tip distribution logic. So what we want to do is, we said earlier, hey, let's create a tip sharing rule. Let's see how easy it is to set up something that is tip sharing from one job code to another job code in the system. So in this case, we want to set this for all of our locations, all 3 of our restaurants that we run. And what we're going to do is set something up for server to bartender. We want to make sure these bartenders are receiving a percentage of the tips that they are helping the servers generate. So great. Okay, we know what that looks like. We'll jump over and say we want them to share 2.5% of the sales item, but we only want them to share it for liquor, wine, and beer, because that's actually all that the bartender is helping with, right? The bartender isn't helping to assist on the appetizers or desserts, things like no category, which may be gift cards and other items. The only things they're helping to sell are these 3. So they should only be receiving a tip out from the servers on the floor for these 3 specific categories. Next, we want to look at who we're collecting this from. And in this case, we're taking this money from the servers and we are distributing it to the bartenders. So when we get this, everything looks good. We'll get a nice rule summary that pops up. Everything looks exactly like what we were hoping for it to. And now I will simply click submit and boom, that is off. That rule is in effect from this moment going forward. Every single time a server makes an alcoholic sale, 2.5% of the sales price of that alcohol is going to be set aside and going back to the bartenders. Now, what if we wanted to do something a little more specific? And we said, okay, what we actually want to do here is for all 3 of our restaurants, we want service staff to support. And so this is, again, we have a host on staff. We want to make sure that our service staff, our servers and bartenders, are fairly sharing to support the weight and the impact that this host is causing. So in this case, we may look at 3% of just tips. Does not have a sales category associated with it. We're just going to give 3% of all tips that are coming in. Here we get to select and make sure that this is credit card tips, gift card tips, and gratuity service charges. This is where TipHaus does something really unique. And so in the previous example, we were looking at a full day. That servers, no matter when they're working, are going to be taking 2.5% of that alcohol sales, setting it into a pool for bartenders that no matter when they're working, you're going to look at how many hours they worked, and they're going to take an equal percentage out. So if I worked twice as much as my fellow bartender, I would make twice as much of the tips from the servers that are tipping us. Whereas time of sale is a proprietary and patented piece to TipHaus. And what this is actually going to look at is it's only going to give credit to the staff members that were working at the same time as those servers and bartenders. So if you have a morning host and a PM host, the PM host is only going to be generating tips that were generated during that PM shift, during the time they were actually clocked in and the time the sales were actually being run through. Very, very unique. It can be the most fair way to handle tip distribution. We often recommend it given the use case. There are some scenarios where we don't, and I'll cover those here coming up shortly. But for now, let's just say, hey, we had the bartender and the servers collecting from, and we're distributing to the host. Same thing, we'll hit submit. We will get to look at this nice little rule summary. And then once we hit submit, this rule is now live. Every single sale taking effect from here forward is going to have that same principle going forward. So those are 2 tip sharing opportunities. Now, most restaurants don't just run on tip sharing. You don't just run on tip pooling. Generally, you're looking to get as granular and detailed as possible because you have the exact idea of how your restaurant should work, who should be making what, how you incentivize this fabulous teamwork and behavior amongst your staff. So we want to layer on a tip pool. And now in this case, we'll say, hey, there should be a front of house tip pool that we want the bartenders and the servers making the majority, but we also want to loop in the host. We say, okay, but I thought we did something on tip sharing already, and we did. But what we can do here is layer these together to get very, very specific and granular and make sure that this is all going to the right areas. So in this case, we said we're going to make this a front of house pool. We want this to affect all locations. We want to make sure that this is working for everyone here. And what we want to make sure that we bring in all 3 service charges. And for this one, we will do this as a daily piece, right? We want to make sure that what we're seeing is that the servers and bartenders are all sharing this no matter what, that individuals, there's prep work all day long, kegs have to be changed, prepping things. We want to make sure that that makes sense. So now we will simply collect our job codes. In this case, bartenders, servers, and hosts, right? This is our front of house staff. These are the individuals greeting and serving these guests. But we don't want them to pool tips perfectly evenly, right? We want to say, hey, our bartenders are typically our most senior individuals. They're the ones who are maybe the most important for guest satisfaction, given that they're taking orders and making drinks for the floor. So we want to make sure that they are able to take a little bit more out of the tip pool. Maybe they're set at 4 points, or this is commonly called a weighted system in fine dining as well. The server, next most important, we want them to take 3 of those 4 points, whereas the host is going to collect 1 here on the back end. So we now have this nice little distribution saying, if everyone here worked 8 hours, this is how the split would be of 4 hours of credit going to the bartenders, 3 hours of tip credit going to the servers, 1 hour going to the host. You can also look at it in cents of dollars. Always going to have an impact on how long your shift worked. But what we want to make sure is that we're getting the majority of the money to the staff members that are leading to the greatest guest impact and satisfaction. So when we click this review button now, we get to a nice summary. This looks perfect. This is exactly what I was hoping for. And same exact principle here. So now we have a tip pool that is in place. And if we wanted to create one more that was very, very unique here, what we could look at is a daily tip pool for all bartenders. And what we can say here is, okay, well, when should this take effect? We have the ability to schedule in TipHaus. And what we're actually wanting to do here is say, hey, on Sundays, NFL games, right? And it's slammed. We do bottomless mimosas. We do bottomless Bloody Marys. Everyone, all the bartenders are all making them all throughout the day. There should not be a time of sale where you're only rewarded for the guest you served. You should be pulling this throughout the day because the AM bartenders, they busted their butts to get things going for the PM bartenders. And the PM bartenders are slinging drinks to the servers who are given unlimited everything. We want to make sure that no matter what, they are going to be pooling tips. This is a team effort. We don't care if they're serving guests. We don't care if they're making mixes. We don't care if they're prepping drinks. They are all doing a lot of work to make sure these tips come flying in. And so with that in mind, we can now set something up that only takes effect on Sundays, the day we do these bottomless drinks, and go through the typical pieces, look at this as a daily rule, set this up to be just bartenders, and now we have a bartender rule in effect that only takes place every single Sunday. And that would be it. And there we can now run 2 tip sharing rules, 2 different tip pools, all in conjunction that align exactly with the restaurant's goals of what we need to accomplish. I'd be remiss to skip a few pieces here. So what TipHaus actually gets you at the end of the day is this beautiful breakdown. And so what you really care about is how much, after all of these tip logic rules have been applied, after these tip pools have been applied, do I actually owe my staff? What should I put on their paycheck, or what should I pay them using TipHaus's Earn Tip Access program? This take home is going to be exactly what you're looking for. That is the taxable line item of tips that you owe your staff after all logic has been applied, after all fees have been removed as needed for credit card tip fees or anything of the sort. And we can now see this is what they're owed. If you ever want to get granular, we can always dive into the individual by individual check. We can see what service charges were, who was gaining from the tip sharing, who was losing a little bit of money from it by putting in for it. And we're looking at a tip pool, same premise, who gained, who took away. But at the end of the day, this take home is always the column that matters the most because that is how you pay your staff out. And a bunch of things that I won't spend a ton of time covering with you, as I can go deep for this conversation forever. But, there's things like auto recognition of pay periods, right? Where we know what your pay periods are and we can segment accordingly. There's segmentation for things like third-party delivery tips, because how you handle those legally often gets pretty messy and you want to make sure you have clean line items for it. Handling things like banquets or catering events, so that you know that you have a staff member that's working that exclusively and should not be included in part of a pool. And then we can get into tons of fun things like auto reconciliation, where we detect changes for clock ins or for clock outs or for refunds, all that good stuff. And last, but absolutely not least, is after all the work that you've put in to make sure this goes incredibly well, we do also offer an Earn Tip Access program. And what this does is allow you to pay out your staff via either the issued card that TipHaus can provide to them, or their existing bank account, employees' choices, they can mix and match. But we want to make sure that they're getting their hard-earned tips that they're working for in an era where we know cash is getting increasingly harder to keep on hand. And with that, I will now bring us back right on into our slide deck. And I hope that was clear. If there are questions coming through, I see that number is sliding up, so I will jump back into that in just a moment here. Here we are. And so when we're going through this, these are just a few of the customer success stories we have, but these are some of our favorite customers, starting with JP out of Wood Ranch, monster concept out of California. If you don't have the chance, very upscale, fabulous, kind of modern barbecue and American food. But boosted efficiency, they save about 35 hours per month per location of their, I think, 17 locations. I did a webinar with them not too long ago, so I'm embarrassed I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but doing some great things over there with them. Then we can go, to Corey Littleton with Firebirds, spanning the entire U.S. from west to east. Great customer, great food concept, great restaurant all around. And they use our ETA program. They get to use our system for several years now. And then, of course, Johnny Condren out of New York City, Grey Dog, fabulous brunch and lunch spot up there. And they've got some incredible boost and staff retentions in addition to their time and monetary savings. So with that being said, please feel free to scan this element. Would love to chat with you all further. Would love to get our sales teams chatting with you and answering any questions. I am more than happy to jump on and look over how your restaurant runs things currently and what that might be. But for now, I am actually going to jump into the fun part of this for me, which is the Q&A here. So looking over this, and holy moly, we've got a lot of questions. So this is awesome. Andy McNelly, for restaurants with seasonal staff, how should we approach tip distribution to ensure fairness during busy and slow periods? We are definitely busy during the beach visitation season. This is a great question, Andy. So what we want to make sure that we're always accomplishing here is that you're staffing correctly. And TipHaus is going to do a great job at looking at how much tips are coming in and therefore how many employees should we have on. So if we can start establishing that baseline, we can start to understand what is the staff that is not present during busy season or is present during busy season, right? If you have to bring in significantly more hosts or food runners or QA, if you open up a patio and therefore you have a whole other section to work, you want to kind of start to determine how to make sure that all of these individuals are fairly accommodated. And that's where things like our scheduling comes in play, right? So you could look at a restaurant that Monday through Thursday, it's more of a business lunch crowd, but Friday and Saturday, it's a beach town. We're seeing a lot more busy activity. So we could schedule different rules to take effect on those weekends to accommodate either more staff or the fact that it's primarily alcohol sales now. We want to get more money to the bartenders and the people working the cocktail lounge, anything of that nature. Lots and lots of avenues, but I'd say scheduling and making sure you understand the correct number of staff and to what level they need to be compensated for the work they're providing for your guests and for your fellow employees. Next up is, how can TipHaus deal with employees' pushback on what isn't fair when it comes to support staff TipHaus? Can they see this somewhere? Oh, that's a great question. Okay. Oh, this is also Andy McNelly. Well, thank you, Andy. Two good questions here. So this one, great question. I think anyone who's been in the service industry long enough, and this is something, I started in high school and worked my way through college as wine bar managers and started at Chili's way back in the day, but everyone thinks the supporting staff doesn't deserve tip outs until you work at a restaurant that doesn't have supporting staff, right? So anyone who's been mature and in this industry long enough will start to see the unbelievable value they derive. So it's worth having just an open conversation with them of saying, hey, this is how much our bussers gets tipped out. This is how much our hostess gets tipped out. This is how much QA or expo. And here is why. Here is the workload they're including. Here is what they're preventing you from having to do. Here's how they enable you to take one more table per turn throughout your shift, right? Additional $25, $30 in tips potentially for you, while you're only having to give up $5 to $10 of that to a tip out. Having these open, blunt conversations, I think, works really, really well. Making sure that these employees understand why they're working together, and it also gives them an opportunity for feedback. One of the most common things we see is, oh, tell me about your tip policies, tell me what you have in place and why. And we'll end up with, oh, I don't actually know why we have it. It's something that the manager before me, manager before them set up in an Excel sheet. We don't actually know if it's accurate. We don't know what it's looking at, but we know we don't want to touch it. And I'd encourage you, and TipHaus can be a great catalyst for that, is we have a free employee app. So all employees can see exactly what is going on, who's helping them, how much their tips are going here, how much they're generating from these. But Transparency isn't something to fear. We want everyone to work as a team. We don't want to have these resentments behind the scenes. We don't want to have any fears like that. So having open dialogues with your staff, making sure they understand what each other is doing for one another. And then in TipHaus, you can always adjust it as easily as going in and clicking the edit button and moving that percentage down. So, hey, maybe 5% of alcohol sales to the bartenders was too much. Let's take that down to 3.5 and let's see how that impacts the numbers and see if that seems more fair to the staff, right? One of these things that you can always be creative with. Next up, and I'll try to tackle as many of these as I can. I know we're coming up at time here, team. Does the time of sale feature take overlapping shifts into consideration? So if the sale happened at 4 or 3 p.m. because the table closed out, would it tip out the server? Yes, it does. So great question. Time of sale works by doing the following. And it says, hey, the moment the first item of that check was rang in, let's say for easy sake, is 1 p.m. And that check was closed out, that credit card was swiped at 2 p.m. So we have a 1-hour shift and there was a $10 tip on that shift, or excuse me, on that check that occurred from 1 to 2 p.m. Anyone who worked that full hour is eligible for their full distribution of that, whatever that may be. If you're tipping out 2.5%, whatever it might be. But say you clocked in at the 1:30 mark. So you've only worked half of that shift or half of that check. What you're actually going to see is you're eligible for half of the typical allocation of the tips. So if you clocked in as a bartender, bartenders typically make 2.5% of alcohol sales. You would in effect make 1.25%. We are always comparing this to the amount of time that you worked. And so that is why we often say time of sale is the most fair and most reputable feature set. What it does is prevent people from staying on and saying, oh, well, I worked part of that check and therefore I get all of my eligible tip out. You delay your clock outs, or that you're trying to clock in a few minutes early because you see a massive catering parties in the back and you want to earn some of that piece. Maybe you could, but you're going to earn 1 minute out of 120 minutes of it, right? It keeps you from being involved in the entire piece when you were not actually directly serving or implementing anything for that guest's satisfaction. All righty. Crystal, can this custom schedule for large events be set for a single day without reoccurrences? Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So we have what's called custom team adjustment, which is what we utilize for banquets and event features. And so what that is we say, hey, one bartender and 2 servers are working a banquet room that's separate of the restaurant. And even though they're clocked in as a bartender and server, we don't want them to be part of the normal tip pool. And we don't want this table to be tipping out to any of the other supporting staff because it is truly served by just these 3 individuals. So what we're always hoping for is to make sure that, if there's a side conversation, a side banquet, a side room, whatever it may be going on, and that is specifically served by individuals, only they are eligible for the tips. Or maybe another bartender's helping to serve things so they can be cut in. But you can set up completely custom and unique tip pools, tip sharing arrangements for specific checks. You can always go through and say, hey, this check needs to be treated differently because this and this and this happened. And so that's always great to see. And last question that I see right here is, how does it work with the POS? What integration do you have with Oracle? Great question, and thank you very much. So it works with the POS. Every POS is different, many of which we are in their marketplace, which you can find online. This is the Toast marketplace, the Square marketplace, and you can find the ad integration for TipHaus right there and there. Some POSs make you request an API key so that we can have access to your data. So you'd let us know and we'd shoot you over a form that says, I authorize TipHaus to do this. You must send it to your account rep. Lots of different avenues and how it's approached by different POS companies out there. But what that actually looks like is we will start pulling in your data. We pull it in every 15 minutes to make sure that we're staying on top of systems. And what integration do we have with Oracle? That is Micro Symphony. And we do work with 3700 through several middleware providers that we've worked with. Several of the customers I've actually talked about today are on 3700, kind of a little bit of an older school system that is working well. But with Oracle, we also work with their Symphony system incredibly well. And have been some great success stories with plenty of their stores. And I don't see any further questions. So with that, I will bid adieu. Actually, no, I'm so sorry. I was about to miss the most exciting part, and I almost messed it up. We have a gift card winner coming up, and that winner here today is Elena Leisure, I believe is how I pronounce it. If I butchered that, Elena, I am so sorry, but congratulations to you. I hope you enjoy Starbucks and the caffeine coming your way. And with that, I will turn it over and thank everyone for joining with us here today. Please shoot us any messages or questions if you'd like to follow up.